Welcome back to Stepwise. Today's guest is an iconic business leader, Kent Thiry. In my many years of practice, Kent stands out as one of the most innovative and successful business leaders I've ever encountered. Let me give you some background. I met Kent in 2000 when he was in his early days at DaVita, a kidney dialysis company formed from a series of previous mergers and not performing well, that is, unsustainably. As I recall it, DaVita was 3 weeks from insolvency when Kent took over, and within 4 years, he had transformed the company to the leader in their industry with the highest clinical outcomes in the history of that industry. And if you know anything about dialysis, people in treatment are chronically ill. So when a major provider like DaVita moves the needle on clinical outcomes, that means that lives are literally being saved. How did he and his team do it? Through 3 simultaneous transformations: financial, operational, and cultural, radically against the prevailing wisdom then and perhaps now that speaks to how much an organization can change. In so doing, not only did he grow the firm, improve outcomes and financial performance, but they created one of the most dynamic cultures the healthcare industry had or has ever seen. In my time with Kent, he advances another fairly unconventional notion, that of citizenship of those in the workforce and how that differs from a typical employment contract, and how to use that citizenship to help all engage, not just in the workplace, but in our society as a whole. He talks about accountability and metrics, 2 things I can vouch for having seen him lead, being central to performance. And he shares with me ideas about how business can take a more active role in community affairs to build the kind of communities, country, and world we're seeking. I hope you enjoy my conversation with Kent Thiry. Kent Thiry, delighted to be able to have this time with you today. You are past chairman and CEO of DaVita, one of the most incredible leadership and culture stories, and you've been doing an awful lot since. So how do you want people to know you?
Well, first of all, I'll start off by thanking you for all the help. So much gratitude flowing right back at you. I think for me, outside of the whole family world, I would just like people to say that he was a citizen leader who worked hard on important stuff. A citizen, because I really believe there's a big difference between living somewhere and being a citizen. When you talk to your 12-year-old child, how do you define citizenship? And then tell me if you're a citizen, because so many people have forgotten that democracy is not a spectator sport. And leader, only in the sense that I'm willing to go out and do new things before other people. Obviously, other people may do better at leading than me, but I have been willing to go into some areas that are somewhat uncharted. And the world has issues, and I think life is a team sport. And if people that have been as lucky as me don't chip in and put our oar in the water, then the world could go to a very bad place.
I'd love to stay there. So, Kent, when you survey the landscape of the leaders you're working with, talking to companies you're involved in, we hear a ton about the amount of tumult, the challenges. When you talk to leaders, what are the most pressing environmental challenges that they're feeling today?
When I talk to my friends and acquaintances that are in that corner office, I think the 2 things they say most consistently are, number one, it's so hard to know when to get involved with something, when to speak out on something versus not. And second, and that one, of course, is commonly discussed and referred to, but second, equally important, is the frustration some of them feel that given that they want to play a constructive role in society and feel they should and not wait until they retire. And so it takes that uncertainty and discomfort and then multiplies it by 10, just because for a bunch of them who care about the world, they're in a frustrating spot. For those who are less civically oriented, less community oriented, it's not that big a deal to go silent. It's not that big a deal to decide what sort of narrow comments to make, because that's the comfort spot they want to be in anyway. But for those who want to step up, like some people had to in the Civil War and in the 1890s and early 1900s and in World War II and in the 60s. These are pivotal times. And for a lot of CEOs, they regard those issues as sort of an inconvenience. And I said, well, no, we are adults. We are alive right now. And just like World War II was inconvenient, you still had to decide as a CEO or as a citizen leader what you were going to do about it. The civil rights movement, if you were the CEO in a southern state where racism was very extreme, you could wish it were different, but it's not. And right now, we can wish the world were different. We can wish our country's momentum was different, but it's not. And so I'm in particular sensitive to those who are wondering, like all of them, but really care and want to solve for doing something.
That's very well said. There's a big difference between struggling with or not knowing what to say and being silent. Very, very big difference.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I would rarely ever ask CEOs to wantonly disregard their fiduciary responsibilities. I mean, absolutely, that's an important part of keeping an economy running, and keeping an economy running is an essential part of achieving equity and prosperity and peace in the world. And so I'm very respectful of the fact that there have to be boundaries. At the same time, I believe that companies and their leadership can be a spectacular vessel for good in the world without taking a whole bunch of political risk, not just on current affairs sort of thing, but just how much a CEO invests in his or her people, and how often the senior team gets together and says either what can we do for society without being foolish. Do you really have a 3-hour spirited debate with facilitation and brainstorming? If you don't, how do you ever pretend to really want to solve such a tricky problem? And then the same thing, how often does your entire team get together and spend 4 hours brainstorming about how to add more value to the lives of your employees? And if you don't spend 3 or 4 hours on it, then you're going to be stuck with doing the same sort of average stuff that everybody else does. And so in both these realms, I think the first test is, well, how hard are you trying? How much of that massive intellect and energy and experience that your team has, your executive team, how much of that are you bringing to the table? And then showing you care by saying, we're going to allocate 4 hours out of a 3-day executive retreat. We're going to spend 4 or 5 hours on this. That's when beautiful things emerge.
Kent, your experience in your 28 years as CEO has taught us, a lot of us, how to demonstrate that commitment. And you're giving some really great suggestions here about, devoting the time and energy, the focus on big questions that really tap the intellect of people, like how are we going to take care of our people? How are we going to maximize their experience? That kind of thing. In looking back, what else could a leader do who doesn't necessarily know how to encourage employees, team members' voices like you have done? What else could a leader do?
Well, I would, maybe there's two paths. One answer, I'll just use the example of what's going on in our democracy here in America and the stresses and strains. And after what happened with Disney in Florida, and after what happened with Coca-Cola and Delta in Atlanta, some CEOs have taken a very, I think, extreme and incorrect conclusion from those and are shying away when, in fact, there are a number of things that a CEO and a company can do to add spectacular value to our democracy without going anywhere near where those companies went. For example, you can encourage your people to be poll workers. You can offer up free pro bono support for all these tiny county jurisdictions that run our elections, have almost no money. You can help them audit their technology. You can help them develop best demonstrated practices, procedures. Yet a third area is you can start to talk about civics and actually have civics taught within your company in a way that's totally equitable, in a way that is not dogmatic or ideological, but fills the gap that exists in so many people's education now, which they never have a serious discussion about what it means to be a citizen. And it can mean different things to different people, but you can't really figure out what it means to you unless you have conversations. And what can companies do with their infrastructure? My gosh, they can facilitate conversations. In addition, a CEO in a company can defend an election integrity once they've invested the resources to confirm that, in fact, that integrity has been demonstrated. And then you could also get involved in the election system itself and work on things like reforming gerrymandering and opening up closed primaries. things that give voice and choice back to the people. So those are 5 or 6 examples of how a CEO in a company can help our democracy at very low risk of any backlash.
What you're pointing out are gaps in people's training, education, background, et cetera, that corporations can step in to fill. It's a fundamentally different relationship between corporation and team member than what we might have seen 40 years ago, 30 years ago, that kind of thing.
And that's why I use the historical analogy of the time in the Civil War, the 1890s, 1900. That's when the people rose up because power was too concentrated amongst a small group of people. And they instituted things like the direct election of senators, things like a private ballot, things like women's suffrage. And so there have been times before where citizen leaders and citizens in general have said, oh my gosh, I can conceptually defend not getting involved because I've got this company and I've got my family and I'm working hard and I got to stay away from politics and this other stuff. You can do that. You can have a philosophical paradigm which says that's okay, but that could mean the world goes to hell in a handbasket on your watch. Uh, and so there just are times where there's extraordinary stresses. It just are times. And there's that old saying, all it takes for evil to triumph is for good people to stand quietly by. And then mobilizing our people within a company in a positive way, again, around the constructive dissemination of information, the constructive discussions, um, having literally history lessons be a part of what you do at work on a voluntary basis and obviously always balanced in terms of ideology. And suddenly, a CEO of a company can create several thousand more activated citizens, not just more activated, but more thoughtful, more tolerant.
Democracy really requires that kind of knowledge and involvement of its citizenry. And so that's a very cool role for leaders in organizations to be able to play.
If democracy is not only not a spectator sport, it's a participant sport, it's also a full contact sport. And that's going to happen. There isn't any form of government where there aren't going to be tussles over who has power. What's the great thing about democracy potentially is that the people have a lot of power, but only if they create a system where that power retains its legitimacy. And so the imperative, just like other times in our history, the imperative for business leaders to get involved in a prudent way is, in my mind, clear. That it will be hard to answer the question your kids might ask you in 15 years, where were you? Where were you when this was happening? Just like 40 years ago, it was where were you when John Lewis and the Freedom Riders were cruising through the South? What were you saying? What were you doing? Where were you when Hitler started taking over other countries and systematically assassinating populations? These are the questions. If things move south, these are the questions each one of us who've been so blessed to be CEOs of companies or senior executives, we will be asked by our kids, or we won't be asked because the kids are afraid the answer will be embarrassing.
We have multi generations in the workplace, all the way from boomers to Gen Zers, and now the Alpha generation Alpha, that all very different needs, all very different training experiences. All these generations now are looking to bring more of themselves, to have a greater voice, to have more personal attention, but to bring more of their humanity into the workplace. If that premise is true, what could leaders do?
Yeah, I think that the potential is just immense, and you're right. It starts with this positive that there's millions of people of all ages who want to do good with their lives at the same time as making a reasonable living, and it's more palpable and tangible, I think, than at other times in our history. And it's great that that's a common denominator across all these different generations. And I think this is where there's the opportunity for the CEO and others in the C-suite to develop a very coherent paradigm for how our company is going to seek to do good for our people and the planet, or whatever exact words people want to use. And you have to do it before you're in a crisis. You have to develop the paradigm ahead of time and say, all right, here's content that's okay for us to discuss, and here's the process through which we will do it. That you have a very explicit filter that you talk about when the stuff has not hit the fan. And so when the stuff hits the fan, you can say, okay, according to our paradigm, this is something that we will uh, get engaged in, and this is how we'll get engaged. We used to say, as you remember at DaVita, community produces most what it honors most. That LeBron James deserves to be rewarded because he's a really good basketball player, but that's nothing to honor. Human behavior is something to be honored. And in this case, what we need companies to do is honor the rules of engagement, honor the opinions of all, which has a natural smoothing and dampening effect for all the obvious reasons that you're letting everyone speak.
To do that, it seems to me that requires great maturity, wisdom, self-regulation, calmness on the part of leaders. And again, these aren't things we necessarily talked about 30 years ago.
Well, I think it's so true. And one of the phrases that you'll recall that I love is intentionality rules. People can tell, even if you're uncomfortable, even if you're not charismatic, people can tell your intentions. And if your intention is to facilitate a healthy conversation amongst your own employees, and then see if you and your company can play a positive role in some way, if people can just feel that intentionality, uh, that that gives you tremendous degrees of freedom in what you do.
You're coming at this from a different worldview than what I typically hear from a business leader. That is to say, we are all citizens. That's a very different, framework from which to lead. Can you think of other kind of paradigmatic shifts like that one that would help govern the leaders moving forward, who are maybe coming to their first or second leadership job during this time? Like, what are the frames that they need to consider?
To the extent you want those jurisdictions to develop business friendly policies to foster a healthy economy, you must proportionally invest in having community friendly policies. Why should voters and the government continue to care about creating a business friendly environment if they think you don't care, if they think you're just as likely to move your factory to India? If that's a make or break decision for your company, that's morally appropriate, because the alternative is to have everybody lose their jobs because you go bankrupt. If it's to improve your margin by 0.5%, well, then what the hell? What values construct does that come from? Where you destroy a third tier city in Oklahoma or New York or California because you move a factory for 0.5 point of margin and destroy that resulting community with all the people that work for you. There's all sorts of things that if you sit in a room with your executive team and say, let's spend a couple hours thinking of how we can do better for the community. Talk to me about how you earn the right for business-friendly policies by having community-friendly policies, and that cannot just be a reasonable wage with reasonable benefits. That's not a fulsome answer.
You're talking about a wonderful involvement, much more holistic involvement on the part of companies that puts a lot of pressure on the average leader to be more engaged, informed, open, all of those things, him or herself.
One quote I've always liked is a Buddhist quote: one cannot pour from an empty cup. But the concept is pretty powerful, that if you do not take care of yourself, physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, whatever that means to you, then your ability to realize your full potential, to be your full self, and to give gifts to others are going to be heavily circumscribed. And so each of us, and particularly those who have the incredible pressure of being a CEO in today's world, you've got to keep your cup reasonably full, or your ability to handle these kind of issues goes down. And so I always say that each one of us have a discipline, just like CEOs often have enough discipline to work out. Well, they need to have enough discipline to think about helping their sort of soul reflect and their soul stay healthy as much as their biceps.
You've been one of the more visionary and optimistic leaders I've ever met. And at the same time, you have a real commitment to metrics and accountability. Can you talk about that? Are those different? Are they complementary? How do you see that?
I had a bad fault of I gave too much negative feedback compared to positive feedback. And so I had to look inside myself a lot uh, and try to figure out why I continued to have that fault. But I realized that in order to change that, I had to track first every meeting. I'd give myself a score of did I, on a net basis, fill people's cups or empty them. And then I got to the point where I did it once a day. And I just kept these in a simple spreadsheet with myself and my assistant, and then a week. And within 2 years, that negative was gone from my 360. And so that's an example of real live operating metrics applied to the CEO in their own growth. But we also would track the metrics of our other programs. Like we had a thing called an academy, where every single teammate from across the country was invited for 2 days to learn more about our mission, our rituals, our language. We would track what was turnover in the subsequent 2 years after people attended the volunteer academy versus those who didn't. And the difference was dramatic. And so when we talked to our board of directors and they said, "Whoa, you're spending a lot of money on this," I was able to say, "Well, yeah, because this is how we want to live. This is how we create a better world, and we can afford to do it. And no one else is going to pull these people together. Uh, and so this is our opportunity to give a gift to the world." But I could also say, and by the way, it more than pays for itself, because here's the turnover statistics, and here's a bunch of the comments. So those are two examples where you need to have operating rigor and metrics if you're going to achieve massive excellence in sort of the behavioral sphere and the engagement sphere, like you want to in the strategic and operating sphere.
When you and I first met, and you had taken over DaVita, I think turnover was 52%, and within a very short period of time, based on some very focused efforts of you and your team, it was down in the high teens or low 20s. And boy, that'll sure pay for a lot of development.
Well, your memory is exactly right. And there's even an equally powerful example. After a few years, and we were kind of at 18% or so, you're right, across our couple thousand clinics across America, we bought another company that was very large. They had about 8,000 employees, and they were in the same cities, doing clinics, ostensibly the same kind of clinics, dialysis clinics, in the same cities across America. And when you did the math, our average wages were virtually equal. So here you have them with 8,000, maybe we had 12 or 13,000, probably active in 30 states, incredible geographic overlap. Their turnover was 40% higher. Their turnover was about 28%. And and that's holding pay constant and holding geography constant across the entire country. And the key difference was that our people felt more respected, more invested in, and more cared for than theirs. And then second, but far less significant, was while our wages were equal, we did significantly more profit sharing than they did. But it wasn't enough money to drive the difference in behavior. Instead, those profit sharing bonuses were differential, and they contributed to reinforcing the teammates' notion that, gosh, I'm working in a place that cares about me.
You know, that to me is one of the most remarkable pieces of this story, in that while turnover reduced dramatically in the first 3-4 years, while people's sense of your care for and esteem of them increased very dramatically, maybe contributing to that, at the same time, you were improving or increasing the amount of accountability and measurement. You know, that's a little counterintuitive for some, that both of these things can exist in some sort of balance or tension or something.
Well, and the analogy I use often is thinking about life balance. That when I'm talking to young MBAs and they ask about these questions, I say, well, job one is to respect how difficult it is. In business, when you have a tough problem, like a manufacturing problem or a marketing problem, when it's important and difficult, you get together, you have brainstorming sessions, you have a strategy, you have initiatives, and you monitor them. It's all sort of self-evident. Of course, we all do it naturally because it would be foolish not to for something important and complicated. And then in our own life, something that's important and complicated, like life balance, we give almost no time to it. Like, would you ever think of building a new factory and not tracking labor? No. But yet we go through life without tracking our nights away from our kids. But the duality that you're referring to is essential. First, to sort of conceptually care, but then second, to bring business rigor in terms of brainstorming and execution to the fore.
When you think about recruiting, when you thought about recruiting leaders into DaVita at the senior levels, what did you look for, and how could you sort out the people that might not be able to make that kind of ethos work?
Yeah, we paid a lot of attention to how community oriented someone was, how open they were to personal growth, how self aware were they, what was their ability to talk about their mistakes, what was their ability to talk about their fault. And when we did retroactive views of how we did on hiring our last 40 vice presidents, it was stunning how the ones who were most likely to be very highly successful at DaVita were growth oriented, were self-aware, and were willing to keep learning and discuss themselves as human beings. And because when we make people better people, they automatically become better business leaders.
Wow. Yeah, that's very powerful. So I'm going to ask you to turn the clock back just a hair. Obviously, the environmental situation a little bit different in today than when you stepped into DaVita. But could the DaVita experience be done again today in light of all of the challenges our workforce is facing and the different workforce you've got? And if that's the case, then what would you, if you were CEO, what would you do differently today than you did before? How would that experience be different?
What I would say, I do intensely believe that creating a community-like environment, being a community first and a company second, is absolutely possible and practical in today's world. Second, I do think it requires greater navigational skills because of what's going on within the country and the world. The common denominator across all generations is a desire to have work be more strongly and fundamentally aligned with your own personal values. And that's a positive. That's something that makes it easier in that there's demand. It just is complicated to give supply. And so I think it's absolutely doable because the interest is higher, but the navigation is greater. What makes it just as doable in the current world as in the old world is letting the people be co-designers. And that's not that you turn everything over, but you do certain things by voting. You listen, and therefore they are designing. It's how you can be confident of success because once they co-design something, they're going to be quite with you in going down that trail. If they help design the path, or in our case, the bridge, they're much more likely to go over it. And so I think that's what makes me, if I were taking over, which I'm very glad I'm not, taking over a big company today, that's why I would be as optimistic as I was 20 years ago.
KT, thank you. Yeah, we could do this for a long time, and I always enjoy it when we're together. So I appreciate your time. For a deeper exploration of your own journey, you can find tools, stories, and reflection questions in my book, Leadership, Rethinking the True Path to Great Leading, or by following me on social media. I'm on LinkedIn and Instagram as Foster Mobley. Until next time, Stepwise.
Thank you for listening to Stepwise. Stepwise is brought to you by Dr. Foster Mobley. Edited and promoted by Zetis. You can listen to more episodes wherever you stream podcasts. Find out more at fostermobleymT.com or follow us on social media at Foster Mobley. That's FOSTERMOBLEY. We look forward to having an inspiring conversation with you soon.